What's going on, everybody? Well, with the release of Spider-Man Homecoming, I think it's a good time to update my Marvel ranking. I did a video like this last year after Doctor Strange came out where I ranked, at that time, all 14 of the MCU movies that have been released. Well, now we got 16 of them, and my list has changed slightly. So, time to rank these movies one more time. And let me go ahead and say before I even start this ranking that Marvel Cinematic Universe is pretty incredible, because even the 2 to 3 movies that I have at the very bottom, I still consider good movies. Like, if I was to give a ranking for the bottom 2 or 3, it would still be a see it on Netflix. There's not a single movie that Marvel has released so far that I think is garbage or trash, and I don't think they ever will. So, pretty incredible feat that you got 16 films that are all, on my scale, fresh. So, starting off at number 16, still my least favorite MCU movie that's ever been released, and that is Iron Man 2. Now, this movie had big shoes to fill when it came out, because Iron Man was the thing that kind of exploded and really kickstarted this MCU. Everybody loved Robert Downey Jr., everybody loved this character that was really a B-list Marvel character that not a whole lot of movie fans even knew about until this movie came around. So the sequel came out, and it's a giant commercial for the Avengers. It's still entertaining, there's still some good back and forth with Robert Downey Jr. and his cast. I still like, even though he's not utilized very well, I like Whiplash as a villain. I didn't really care for Justin Hammer, which is unfortunate because I love Sam Rockwell. And I love the introduction of Black Widow. Just the movie just had so much shoved into it. It was trying to introduce so much, so many new characters, lead into Avengers so much that it forgot to be a good Iron Man film. Now, it's still entertaining, but just this is the most forgettable movie on the MCU to me. This is the one that I rewatched the least because I already know the Avengers are coming out, and I've already seen the Avengers. So most of what this movie accomplishes isn't really that pliable whenever you try to rewatch it. It's a giant commercial for what we've gotten years ago. So it's a very forgettable movie, but very enjoyable if you just kind of throw it on, turn your brain off, maybe even just do some work in the background. Enjoyable enough. Iron Man 2, that's number 16. Number 15, just edging out Iron Man 2, is Thor: The Dark World. Now, I enjoyed this movie a little bit more than I do Iron Man 2 because this is actually definitively a Thor movie. It's not trying to do anything else but be a Thor movie. But the big Achilles heel of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the villains, really holds this one back for me. Thor is facing off against the Dark Elves, and it comes into the storyline where Jane, his love interest, played by Natalie Portman, gets kind of sucked into this red matter, which ends up being one of the Infinity Stones, and the Dark Elves are trying to get her. And the humor in this movie is taken too far, which is kind of a trend that we've gotten a little bit in the MCU as of late, especially. But just, it's enjoyable. Some of the jokes really land, like some of the one like where Thor goes and hangs his hammer on the key hook. But like Kat Dennings has like a one-liner every once in a while, and about 3 out of 10 jokes that she gives really lands. I don't really care for the Professor character all that much. Even whenever he was in the Avengers, I was like, I can do without that character altogether. And just at the end of the day, it just wasn't as good as the first Thor movie by any stretch of the imagination. I love the opening of the movie whenever it's actually on Asgard and he walks up. And anyone else, that whole scene, I love that. But as soon as it starts getting into it and starts to get into the drama on Earth, it really tags this movie down quite a few pegs. Then it kind of brings it back up in the third act whenever they get back on Asgard. You got Loki and Thor working together. Loki is still great as ever. So, still an enjoyable movie that I actually recommend seeing, but not anywhere near as enjoyable as the rest of the movies on this list. That's why it's number 15. Coming in at number 14 is the new addition to this list, is the movie that came out just a couple of months ago and really disappointed me, and that's Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Now, you're going to see the first Guardians of the Galaxy much higher on this list, and you're going to understand why this was such a disappointment to me. And this movie is very, very split on the reception. You have people who are so pissed and disappointed at it, and you have some people that actually consider it better than the first one. And to me, the problem with this movie is that it's not the worst of the MCU, but it tells the worst story that the MCU has ever told. It's just a very boring, uninteresting story, and it's a very mean-spirited movie, which means that you could tell that James Gunn really got a lot more creative freedom with this one. He didn't really have the MCU leashes on him as much, and the James Gunn really comes through in this. If you watch any of James Gunn's other movies, it's very mean-spirited, very down, very evil storylines, and it kind of bleeds a little bit too much into this. The whole storyline with how things work out with Ego the Living Planet is not how I wanted to see things go with that character, especially being played by the great Kurt Russell. The Guardians themselves are just one-liner after one-liner after one-liner, And Peter Quill, who was the best character of the first movie as far as the storyline goes, is the least interesting storyline in this movie by far. I think that Baby Groot is cute. I think that Rocket Raccoon has some really good scenes. Yondu is the best character in the entire movie, but again, they do something with his character at the very end as far as his relationship with Peter Quill that just feels very rushed and forced and just comes out of nowhere. They didn't really build up to it at all in this movie, and so it really lands flat for me. You got Drax the Destroyer, who doesn't destroy a damn thing in the entire movie. He just talks and jokes the entire time. And just, I feel like I'm giving all negatives. It's still a fun, enjoyable movie. It's a little space opera. It still has a lot of the charm of the first Guardians of the Galaxy, but not nearly as well pulled off as the first one. So, highly disappointed me, but still an enjoyable movie. You'll hear that a lot. Like I already said in my disclaimer at the beginning, still an enjoyable MCU movie. So, that's number 14. Number 13 is a movie that I actually consider to be a pretty good movie. The only reason it's so low on this list is because it's the one MCU movie that's basically the abandoned, forgotten chapter, and that is The Incredible Hulk. This came out back in 2008, right after Iron Man hit the scene, and this was kind of like the reboot because of how horrible the Ang Lee Hulk is. And this is a really good Hulk movie. You got Edward Norton playing Bruce Banner. The villain's really cool as far as Tim Roth. The Abomination, I think, is what he ends up becoming, which is a great third act fight, even though the CGI is not nearly as advanced as it is today, so it hasn't aged quite as well, but it's still a really good fight. And it's just a good movie of Bruce Banner on the run trying to contain the Hulk. And if they would have expanded on that, if we would have got Ed Norton to be in a sequel, or even if he was in the Avengers, I think we still would be very happy with our Hulk. Mark Ruffalo's Hulk is great, but this is a really good Hulk movie. But like I said, it's totally abandoned, totally forgotten, because not only is Edward Norton's version of the Hulk, the design of the Hulk that they use in this, the characters with the exception of General Ross, who ends up being in Civil War for a very small role recently, was basically just all forgotten, and Marvel almost acts like this movie doesn't even exist. So that's why it's so low on the list, is because this is the one movie in the MCU that you could just completely skip and not watch this at all. And if you watched every other single movie that's on the MCU, you really haven't missed anything. There's nothing that's introduced in Incredible Hulk that you need to know going forward. So, total forgotten chapter, that's why it is number 13. Number 12 was the movie that came out at the tail end of last year, which sparked me doing my original ranking for this MCU, and that is Doctor Strange. Now, I've rewatched Doctor Strange since, and I enjoy it a lot more than I did in the theaters, but I still stick to where I put it on this list, because this is where the Marvel formula is really starting to wear thin for me. It's where all the movies are starting to feel very similar. Doctor Strange feels too much like a Iron Man, Tony Stark copy to me, even though he's still acted very well by Benedict Cumberbatch and still an enjoyable character. And I like the whole new spin in the MCU where it's starting to talk about like magic and sorcery and everything like that. That works well, but it still feels so much like a Marvel movie that it doesn't really have its own identity like you would think a movie like this would have. Special effects are incredible. I think the villain, again, really weak MCU villain, played by the great Mads Mikkelsen, so it's definitely not him. And then you get the side character played by Chiwetel Ejiofor of Mordo, I think his name was. And they're clearly building this guy up to be a major player later on, possibly even a really big villain in Doctor Strange 2. But he just kind of feels rushed along in this movie. The whole progression of him being sidekick to eventual villain just feels rushed in this. So, really the formula was the biggest negative for me. Everything else about this movie is the same. Things that you're going to hear are positives in all the MCU movies. Great characters, great writing, really good humor, really good special effects. But it just feels too similar to everything else to be tackling something so different in the MCU. So, still hold it at number 12. Number 11 is the other movie that we just got this past weekend, which is why I'm doing this list again, and that is Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, if you watch my full review, I'm very torn on this movie because there's things that this movie does really well and there's things that it does that really aggravate me. I think Tom Holland and Michael Keaton were great. I think that the integration into the MCU and the integration of Tony Stark was done really well because it wasn't distracting at all. I think the high school setting is really charming and it was a really good, like, unambitious way to bring Spider-Man into this MCU because it's not really trying to be this grand, epic Spider-Man movie like all the other ones were. It kind of takes its time to breathe a little bit, which is a good breath of fresh air. They do a lot of different things with Spider-Man. Spider-Man fits totally into the MCU, and the MCU formula fits Spider-Man really well. but I'm still wore thin on the MCU formula at this point. So even though it fits Spider-Man much better than some of the other characters, I'm still tired of seeing it. It still feels like an MCU movie. The movies all are really just starting to feel so similar. The other flaws that I have with this movie, which hold it down so much, is that a lot of really playing and meddling with the comic book storylines and the comic book characters. Like Flash Thompson was a horrible character. They try to do this new weird version of MJ, but not calling her Mary Jane, but she's still MJ. You got like weird characters like Betty Brant that shows up, but it's not Betty Brant at all. You got some different version of the Scorpion. There's a lot of really strange things that if you're a comic book fan are just weird, and they just drag the movie down for you because they're so distracting and they're so strange. Action sequences weren't great. They were good enough. There's nothing that's like bad, but they're just nothing inventive. They're nothing really ambitious. Like the sequence on the plane is probably the coolest action sequence in the movie. The rest of them either feel like retreads or you can't really tell what's going on because it's so quick cut and the camera's going all over the place. So I enjoy Spider-Man Homecoming, but it was a disappointment for me. I don't think it's the greatest MCU movie in the world. I don't think it's the greatest Spider-Man movie in the world like a lot of people are saying. It's solidly in the middle of this list at number 11. Number 10 is Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, I really enjoy this movie a lot more than most people. A lot of people shit on this as being some of the worst of the MCU or being like wildly worse than the first movie. I don't quite agree with that. It's definitely not as good as the first one, mainly because the villain, Ultron, is much more of a jokey Tony Stark copy. And that's one of the things, again, it's a theme throughout the MCU, is that they sacrifice drama and tension and terror in the villain that you thought Ultron was going to be for humor and one-liners and jokes. And a lot of the back and forth between all the Avengers is as good as it was in the first one. I like the scene whenever the movie opens up and you've got Captain America saying, "Hey, language!" and Tony Stark's like, "What? Gosh darn it, watch your dang language." Stuff like that is always classic. I love the Hulkbuster scene, probably the best scene in the movie. Whenever Iron Man's trying to take down the Hulk, you got the integration of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Quicksilver is a little bit weak, but then again, if you've seen the movie, you know that's not really going to be a problem going forward. But just a really enjoyable movie, a really epic movie, a lot of great action sequences, a lot of great humor, like the scene, especially whenever they're trying to lift Thor's hammer, that's a great one. Just really enjoyable movie for me. Just the villain holds it back for me because the villain could have put this above the first Avengers because Ultron is a great villain. And you got James Spader, a great voice, but they just sacrificed all of that for jokes. So that's why it is solid at my number 10. Number 9 is the original Thor. Now, if you know anything about me, I'm not a big fantasy guy. I'm not a big sorcery guy. I'm not a big, Dungeons and Dragons kind of guy at all. So on paper, this movie should have been horrible to me, but it's not. It's really enjoyable. Thor is a great character. A lot of his side characters, with the exception of Kat Dennings here and there, and even, Natalie Portman's kind of a weak love interest, but she's still enjoyable enough because she's a great actress. There's a lot of great side characters in this. You got the best villain of the MCU, Loki. You got Anthony Hopkins, who is awesome as Odin. My favorite scene in this entire movie is whenever they're taking on the Frost Giants and Odin shows up to stop his son, and he's like, "Father, we'll finish them together," and he goes, "Silence!" I love that damn scene. That's classic Anthony Hopkins to me. So I really enjoy the hell out of this one. I love all the Asgard stuff at the beginning and in the end. I think it has epic stakes. I think the special effects are great. I love the character growth of Thor from being this cocky, entitled dickhead to being this protector. Being this guy who's willing to lay down his life to sacrifice to save people. Like, it's one of the best character growths in the MCU. And Kenneth Branagh did a great job directing this. And it sets actually the bar really high for Thor Ragnarok, which is coming out later this year, because Thor movies, for most people, end up being towards the bottom of the list, but this one's actually quite damn good. So Thor Ragnarok, if it beats out Thor, that's a great accomplishment. So I really enjoy this movie. That's why it's my number 9. Number 8 is Captain America, the First Avenger. Now, I loved this movie a lot when I first saw it in theaters because I love the war setting. I love the character of Captain America. I love everything that he represents and everything that he stands for. I thought that Red Skull was a really good villain. I like all the side characters, like Tommy Lee Jones is awesome. Sebastian Stan is really good as Bucky Barnes. The love interest of Agent Carter is great. One of the best love interests in the entire MCU. That is just a tragic storyline between Steve Rogers and Agent Carter, how they just long for each other, but their love is just doomed. So really great. I love the fact that they keep coming back to that storyline in the other Captain America movies. The reason why it's so low on this list is just because the other movies that have come out after it are just so freaking good. So this is a damn good movie. It's a damn good origin story. fucking great character. Captain America is probably my favorite character in the MCU, and Chris Evans plays him perfectly. You know, everybody was worried about him after he came from the Johnny Torch character, because that's not Steve Rogers at all, but he just nails this character. He is Captain America to me. So I go back to this movie and rewatch it a lot. I really enjoy it. It's a great period piece slash Marvel movie. It still has a little Marvel formula to it, but for me this one has a lot more identity than most movies in the MCU, so really big praise for this one. That's why it is my number 8. Number 7 is Ant-Man. Now this one really benefits from that new approach that the MCU started to take, where they said, you know what, let's just make a specific genre of filmmaking, but set it in the MCU. Like the Captain America Winter Soldier is a 70s political action thriller set in the MCU. And then you have movies like Ant-Man, which is a heist movie set in the MCU. And I love the heist movie aspects of this. I love Paul Rudd. Paul Rudd is great. I think he's hilarious, and he actually pulls off the action sequences really well in this, and he fits the MCU very well. I love Michael Douglas, the great Michael Douglas, as Hank Pym. I think the villain's actually pretty good. He's not overly memorable, but he's not nearly as egregious as most of the MCU villains. In Yellow Jacket, Corey Stoll did really well with him. Just the special effects in this movie is what's so great, because you get so many sequences when Ant-Man is shrunk and he sees the giant version of everything else, like the fight whenever they're on the little toy train, and then it zooms back out to real life and the toy train just goes like, great humor in this movie. This is one of the few times when the humor overload of the MCU really fits the character, the story, and it doesn't really distract me too much. So I really enjoy Ant-Man. I can throw this on and it doesn't quite feel like a superhero movie to me. It does feel like a definitive heist movie that just has some superpowers in it, with the exception of the one Avengers scene, which is actually utilized pretty well. But I just enjoy the hell out of this. So that's my number 7. Number 6 is a movie that probably is on the top of most people's list, and that is the first Iron Man. Now don't get me wrong, I absolutely love Iron Man. The only reason it's a little bit lower is because some of the movies that are above this, I love even more. So Iron Man is a great movie. It kicked off the MCU. It was a huge breath of fresh air when it came out in 2008. I mean, it just knocked everybody's socks off. Nobody had seen anything quite like this. And it came out the same year as The Dark Knight. So having The Dark Knight come out and have another superhero movie come out and still be just as memorable and probably even more important to superhero movies altogether, huge feat. Robert Downey Jr., classic. I mean, just the dude came out of Hollywood jail to give the character of his life, the role of his life in Tony Stark, and he nailed it. Even the guy who played Rhodey in this, who never continued on, I forget his name right now, but he was great. You get the villain Obadiah Stane, who's played by Jeff Bridges, who's a really good villain in the MCU. Not the best, but he's definitely a good villain. I love the movie's progression, where it goes from Tony Stark being the cocky, arrogant Tony Stark to starting to, you know, appreciate life and appreciate the danger of what he's doing, and starts to grow as this character, and he's starting to build his suit, and a lot of great humor in this movie, like the training sequences, and then it builds up to this ultimate confrontation, and just such a good origin story, such a great MCU movie, and such a great comic book film, and that is why the first Iron Man, the great Iron Man, is my number 6. But my number 5, which is probably the most controversial thing on my list because most people hate this movie, is Iron Man 3. To me, it's even better than the first Iron Man. Now, I know everybody hates the Mandarin shit. Since I'm not a deep-cut Iron Man comics fan, it never really bothered me. I understand completely why people hate it, but for me personally, never bothered me. I actually thought it was pretty funny whenever I saw it in the theaters, and it still makes me laugh when I get to that scene. Oh, bloody hell, bloody hell. I enjoy the hell out of that, but I'm also a Shane Black fanatic, so his writing, his directing just kills me. I think it fits this story perfectly. I love how Tony Stark has to utilize other elements aside from his armor to take down the villains in this movie. This is the Tony Stark movie, not really an Iron Man movie, and that's a great change of pace, great breath of fresh air. Setting it on Christmas, just another Shane Black trope that I love. The villain, a lot of people don't like Aldrich Killian. I really like him. I think Guy Pearce was a great villain. I love how it kind of pulled a switcheroo with the whole Mandarin thing again. I know people hate that. I actually enjoyed it, thought it was really clever. Eventually, would I like to see the Mandarin come back? Probably. They gave a little bit of a tease on it with one of those little Marvel short films, but it's all going to depend on how much Robert Downey Jr. wants to remain in the MCU, so don't get your hopes up. Maybe we'll see him. But I love the action sequences in this. I love the humor. I love Robert Downey Jr. I love the that Happy has more of a role in this because I really like that character. So I really enjoy Iron Man 3. I'm one of the defenders. I know most people hate this movie. I'm going to get a lot of shit in the comments for placing it so high, but you know what? Gotta say how I feel. I love Iron Man 3. That's why it's my number 5. Number 4 is Captain America Civil War. Now, this was a big movie that came out last year. This was basically like the Avengers 2.5. You were integrating Black Panther, you were integrating our new Spider-Man, you had Captain America facing off with Tony Stark. And what I love about this is even though it's got a lot of people in it, and even though Tony Stark plays a huge role in this movie, this is still a definitive Captain America storyline. And it's a great way to build off the awesomeness of Winter Soldier. I think this movie is epic. It's got great stakes, even though it could have gotten a little bit bigger as far as if somebody would have died, at least one or two characters would have died, especially one that they basically hint is going to die, but they still bring him back. That's one of the lightness things of the MCU that bothers me once in a while. Could have had more stakes, but the action sequences, like the whole airport sequence, some of the best you're ever going to see. Captain America is awesome in this. The whole drama between him and trying to protect his friend Bucky Barnes, who everybody wants to kill. I love how they integrate it and really just expand on the drama of that storyline all the way to the final act of the movie, which pulls a little twist that some people it doesn't work quite so well for. To me, it works well. They could have made it a little bit less convenient and made it be a little bit more acceptable for some people, and that kind of goes along with the villain in this, who is Baron Zemo. Now, some people hate this character. I think he's one of the better villains we've gotten in the MCU because he's so understated. All he's doing is being really human and having a really human motivation for doing what he does, while just kind of pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He doesn't try to blow up buildings. He's not out there being maniacal or twirling his mustache or building Iron Man armor or anything like that or trying to blow up New York City. He's just pulling strings and getting people where he wants them. Now, few sections, they do take it a little bit too far and make it stretch your imagination too far, but the whole concept of that villain I actually really like. So, Marvel knocked it out of the park with Civil War. It's still one of the best superhero movies that's ever been made, and obviously it's one of the best MCU movies because it is my number 4. Number 3 for me is the original The Avengers. Now, this movie was when the Marvel Cinematic Universe really needed to prove itself because all of the build-up to The Avengers was so huge and so anticipated that if this movie wasn't awesome, everything that they had worked for would have fell on its face. But they knocked this out of the park. You got Joss Whedon, who helped write this movie and also directed it and just knocked it out of the park. Everything that Joss Whedon does great, he does phenomenally in this. All of the back and forth between all the Avengers, from the rivalries to the friendships, are great. Some of the best action sequences, and you get just action sequence after action sequence after action sequence in this. Using Loki as the main villain, genius, because he's the best villain we've gotten in the MCU, and he's probably at his best in the Avengers. Some awesome humor, like with the Hulk. The Hulk was the best character in this movie, and he was the character that everybody could have cared less that was in this movie because we barely got to see him in any of the other movies. The Incredible Hulk was all but forgotten. And whenever he was in this, like whenever he punches Thor or whenever he beats the shit out of Loki, the scenes like that are the most memorable and hilarious scenes in this movie. This movie's a triumph. It's an absolute triumph. It's one of the greatest comic book films that's ever been made. They're going to be extremely lucky if they can get even close to how good the original Avengers is when they make Infinity War and whatever they decide to call the fourth one. Huge shoes to fill because this movie is phenomenal. That's my number 3. Number 2 is the first Guardians of the Galaxy. Now you understand why 2 disappointed me so much, because this one I love so much. I loved everything about this. I knew nothing about Guardians of the Galaxy. Didn't really have a whole lot of interest in seeing the movie in theaters. Didn't really have any faith in it. I figured this is going to be Marvel's first failure. Everybody thought that. And it's one of their best movies, if not their best. Honestly, most people put this at their number 1. It's just edged out a little bit by my number 1. Now, Guardians of the Galaxy just nails everything you want in a comic book movie, but it feels the most different of any of the MCU movies, which is probably another reason why I love it so much. It feels like a space opera. It doesn't really even have that many ties to the MCU, with the exception of a few Infinity Stone things. And I just love all the characters. Every single one of these Guardians, from Peter Quill to Rocket Raccoon to Groot to Drax to Gamora, they're all awesome, and that's a really hard feat to do, to have groups of people, like 5 characters that we have never had any interaction with before, never had any introduction to, and you walk away loving every single one of them for very different reasons. They all work great together, they were acted great. Some of the really good action sequences as far as like space battles and stuff like that, some really great humor in this. This is when the Marvel Cinematic Universe is firing on all cylinders with their humors with the Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one. So I have no flaws with this movie. I absolutely love it. I even like Ronan the Accuser as the villain, which is most people's flaw with this movie. I think he's a great villain. He's probably my number 5 as far as top 5 villains in the MCU. Really love this movie. Can endlessly watch this. I really hope that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 gets back to the greatness of this one, since 2 disappointed me so much. Just cannot say enough how much I love this movie. That's why it's my number 2. But my number 1, which also happens to be my number 1 favorite comic book movie of all time, unless Logan over time starts to overtake it, which it's such a good movie it just might do that, is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I was not ready for The Winter Soldier when this movie came out. I was really looking forward to it. I figured it was going to be good. I really liked the first Avenger. Was still coming off the high of the Avengers. And holy shit, Winter Soldier was so good. This movie is flawless to me. The action sequences, some of the greatest action sequences in any movie ever, not just comic book movie, in any movie ever. Like the elevator sequence to me is one of my favorite comic book and favorite action sequences ever put on film. I love that sequence. I could watch just that sequence on loop for hours. I love it so much. The tenseness of it. Chris Evans really brings a new flavor to Captain America. You get the introduction of Falcon, who is a great sidekick for him. An awesome villain in Robert Redford, which really you have 2 villains in this, because the Winter Soldier is still a villain, even though he's a sympathetic villain. He's a badass and really scary, intimidating villain. And then you also get the awesomeness of Robert Redford and his like 70s spy thriller villain in this, who I think is the second best villain of the MCU, just behind Loki. And not enough people talk about him as a great MCU villain because he's a human. He's not some big superpowered human being, so nobody really remembers him, but he is great. I mean, just the way the progression of the story is, the 3-act structure of this, the 70s thriller aspect of this is so good. The direction by the Russo brothers, who came from Community, holy shit. Nobody expected this to be so good. They expected it to just totally fall on their face. You got comedic directors trying to do a 70s thriller comic book movie. I cannot say enough. I could do an entire hour-long video on how awesome this movie is. I absolutely love Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Not only my favorite comic book movie of all time, but my number 1 greatest Marvel Cinematic Universe film of all time. Well, that does it for my update of my MCU ranking, guys. Put your own ranking down in the comment section below, because I want to hear from all you guys on where these movies fall for you, especially the new ones, Spider-Man: Homecoming and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, because those movies have very different reception for everybody that I speak to. So put your rankings down below. Please like and share this video. And if you're not already a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. That way you get to come back and check out my future content. And if you want to check out my social media links, I've got Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter down below, including my new Patreon page, which is a great way to support this channel. And it's also a great way to not only get exclusive content for yourself from me, but also play a good part into what videos I do in the future, because if you're a patron, you can choose a movie for me to review. That's one of the benefits of being a patron, so definitely check out my Patreon page, guys. Great way to support this channel. And if you want to check out some more of my videos, you can check out a few more by clicking right over here.